Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the second webinar of the Justice Collaboratory's Spring Solidarities webinar series. I'm Dana Green. I'm the Director of Membership and Social Practice here at the Justice Collaboratory. These webinars spotlight the transformative power of partnerships with contributors to the second volume of the Notebook. And I want to tell you a little bit about the notebook before we dive into our conversation today with our very engaging panelists. The notebook itself is a collection of art, scholarship, opinion, and insight that holds a divergent space in a traditional world. It exists somewhere between an academic journal and a popular magazine. And by blending the perspectives of academic research and the rigor of lived experience, it expands the conversation about justice and safety to render a more complete picture of the complex emotional issues in the real world. This volume, volume two, our second volume, is centered on the theme solidarities, the people, the work, and the practices that lift our energy and bring us together. And you can download your own copy of the notebook at www.justicehappenshere.yale.edu, or if you're somebody interested in a printed version, you can order one on the webinar events page. Throughout the webinar series, panelists will share their lived experiences, research insights, and on-the-ground strategies that illuminate how solidarities take root in addressing some of the nation's most imminent threats to safety and justice today. And I think our panelists today, you're going to hear all three of lived experience, research, and on-the-ground strategies. We are fortunate enough today to have the founders of Maryland's Safer, Stronger Together initiative with us, Vinny Schiraldi and Seema Gajwani. And they will discuss their work in Maryland together, their collaboration, and the Safer, Stronger Together initiative. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panelists and get the conversation started. Vinny Schiraldi has been fighting against the mass incarceration of adults and young people for 45 years. He started as an advocate and provider of alternatives to incarceration, as founder and executive director of the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice in San Francisco and the Justice Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. He then became what one reporter called, and I think this is a great compliment, a radical administrator, running Washington, D.C.'s and later Maryland's youth justice systems and New York City's probation and corrections departments. He counts 4 different mayors and 1 governor as former bosses. Along the way, he has taught at Harvard and Columbia, where he co-founded the Columbia Justice Lab. The through line to Vinny's career has been developing humane and innovative policies that are consistent with public safety. And he is currently a fellow at the Pinkerton Foundation. And he wants me to tell you, yes, it's that Pinkerton. Seema Gajwani is the executive director of Maryland's Safer, Stronger Together initiative, a cross-agency, place-based effort to serve families and communities. Prior to this position, at the DC Office of the Attorney General, she was special counsel for juvenile justice reform and chief of the restorative justice section, where she oversaw juvenile justice reform initiatives and founded the Prosecutors Restorative Justice Program. Previously, Ms. Gajwani ran the criminal justice program at the Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, D.C., funding efforts to improve criminal and juvenile justice systems across the country. Ms. Gajwani started her career as a trial attorney at the D.C. Public Defender Service, representing juveniles and adult defendants. She graduated from New York University School of Law and Northwestern University. And in 2019, Ms. Gajwani was selected to be an Obama Foundation Fellow for her work on restorative justice. Seema and Vinny, welcome. And at the top of our conversation, if you could talk about why you felt an article about the initiative that you worked on, Safer, Stronger Together, was a good fit for the notebook.
Amy, you want to go first, or you want me to take a
I'll
shot?
let you go ahead, Vinny.
Um, Well, thanks for having us on. First of all, Dana, this has been a really terrific experience. And I do not say that about every journal article. To me, it felt like, as you were explaining earlier, um, I think the things Seema and I wanted to say had more research in them than you would want to say for a regular magazine article. But but we wanted to uh, talk about this innovation in a way that wouldn't necessarily make its way into a peer review academic journal that was research heavy. So it was meant to be more popularly readable than what you would put, and more, I shouldn't just say popularly, more readable for policymakers too,
Mm.
than what you'd normally get out of an academic journal, but not an Atlantic article in a way that, we really needed to sort of stake what we were doing to the research we were looking at, which was accurate about the way we went about the work.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Vinny was the one who brought this to me. I think he was in touch with you, Dana, and it seemed like a great opportunity once I got a chance to speak to you and your team and to learn about the notebook and look at the original compendium. It seemed to me that this was a research article that was human centered, which is
Mm.
different than most research articles. It was both rigorous, but also inclusive and beautiful. Early on, you told us that you cared about people's voices, you cared about pictures, you cared about design, and you cared about beauty, which I think is a great way to live and to work. So it was a pleasure and an honor to be invited.
I love that, human-centered. Which leads to my next question. The article, I think, really effectively illustrates the power of solidarities on many levels, from interagency solidarity, community solidarity. But I'm curious, before we get into the meat of the article, to hear more about the connection between the two of you and your team. And can you talk about what it was like to reflect on building this together and what you might have learned or how that connection was affected by the writing process and writing together?
And now you go first this time.
Okay, I'll go first. Well, for as with most people, Vinny is an inspiration to me, as he is to most people, is what I mean to say. And so it's always been just an honor to be able to work for him, and then also with him. The thing about working with Vinny in any context, both in writing but also in the world, is that and anyone who knows him will agree with me. Vinny's got the clearest moral compass, like
Mm.
an airtight vision, and he is breathtaking in the way that he can articulate a problem and the need and a solution. And in many ways, like I'm the bureaucrat. I'm interested in relationships and in systems and in people and how systems work and how they change. And so I think that actually we were quite a good combination because I could always turn to Vinny for a refresh on the vision and the goal and what was really important. But also I could bury myself in the execution of that vision on the day to day.
So, um, thank you for that, Seema. I will say that on the stereotypical definition of bureaucrat, you're not the bureaucrat. I would say that we're a Venn diagram when it comes to vision, with an enormous amount of overlap, and that your job was more implementation and mine was more resource gathering and obstacle breaking, um, which I think is what I always view my job as. Like if I'm involved in details, at the same time I'm trying to engage in reform efforts to combat mass incarceration, we're screwed. Not because I'm not bad at details. I could ultimately do it. I'm not great at it, but I'm not bad at it. But then I wouldn't be doing the other stuff. And then I'd also be micromanaging the folks that, I bring around me. And that's no way, that's no way to win this. I mean, pushing back against mass incarceration from inside these institutions is daunting. And if you don't have a team around you that you can trust, that believes in the mission, and that is, sort of 24/7 trying to achieve that mission, you won't get it done. And so I was just talking to a friend, Brent Cohen, recently. Brent ran OJP. He was the director of the Office of Justice Programs for, I think, gives away $6 billion a year, under Biden towards the end. And two of my former colleagues that worked for me, Sharon Goodwin and Stanley Richards, just became commissioners of, respectively, New York City's Department of Probation and New York City's Department of Corrections. And Brent worked for me, and he ran OJP. And, we sat there and we added up 9 people that worked for me have become department heads. And I think that's because I picked good people, but also gave them the freedom to be the good people that they are, and they were. And so therefore that got recognized by the powers that be. And I feel like that's the relationship, that's the solidarity that Seema and I had. The mission is sacrosanct. And I say that with a deliberate choice of words because, there's not a lot of consensual validation inside government for ending mass incarceration. There's the occasional bit of lip service, but there's not a lot of real consensus around it. And it's really hard because no matter how well you're doing, people under your care are going to do bad stuff every once in a while. And if the elected official cuts and runs as soon as that happens, well, then you might as well just not start, because it's inevitable that, with big numbers of people that you're working with, it's going to happen. And so it takes a lot of stuff going right and a lot of solidarity, including like the relationship Seema and I had, and I had with others on my team.
Well, I think that leads us to the next question, which is going to bring us into the article. Tell us how Safer, Stronger Together came to be.
Okay. So, like I started in the article, when I was a kid, I was growing up in a blue-collar neighborhood in Brooklyn. There were literally 2 factories at the end of my block. And it was pre-mass incarceration. I'm 67, so I was, coming of age in the 60s and early 70s. Pre-Eton Pates, who, was the kid that got kidnapped and ultimately killed. That really changed freedom for children, especially in urban areas. A lot fewer kids got to go out and play on the streets after Eton Pates was kidnapped. It really freaked a lot of parents out. And so we were out all the time. We were always out. It was like 6 years old. My mom sent me out, come back when the streetlights come on or when you're hungry. And that was true for everybody on the block. And part of the reason for that was that everybody on the block was your mother and father. And that if you were in trouble, they would intervene. If you were being stupid and getting in fistfights or cursing, they would yell at you. And like the old saw is, if you answered them back in an era before cell phones and before a lot of people on my block even had phones, your mom would know about it and you'd be in trouble. And so that was a community cohesion story. That was a story of informal social controls keeping us safe when there were way fewer people in prison and way fewer cops. We took care of it. And that's still true in lots of communities. And then when mass incarceration happened and we started to outsource safety to police, prosecutors, courts, and prisons and jails and juvenile facilities, I think we damaged our country. Not only did we withdraw millions of people from their neighborhoods, we withdrew agency. We withdrew power and resources. And so as we puzzle, all of us who do puzzle about this, how to, reverse that, it's not about just treating Vinny when in lieu of incarceration or as he reenters his community. It's how do we reverse that disempowerment of communities. So that's the conversation we started with, that essential conversation. And in our second cabinet meeting, Governor Moore was having cabinet meetings in all different parts of the state. I sat down with two other agencies who have their fingers in massive numbers of people in our state and every other state. Human Services, right? DHS. Is it Human Services? Is that what Raphael ran? Yeah. And Department of Public Safety and Community Supervision, which in Maryland is corrections, a few jails, not every jail, but some jails, everybody on probation, everybody on parole. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of families throughout the state of Maryland. In fact, my department was the smallest, right? We had about 1,800 young people on our caseload, which, touched about that many families, and said, let's do this together because we are massively impacting these people's neighborhoods. And let's have a couple of, concepts that we're going to re-empower them. We're going to find resources to reinvest in their communities. And we're going to allow them to drive the use of those resources to help achieve safety in their communities. We're not going to come in and tell them what to do with those resources. We're going to flip that and say, Dana, what does it take to improve in your East Baltimore neighborhood safety? Because I'm guessing you have a bigger dog in that fight than my case managers who are coming in from the suburbs every day. So that's where we started. We laid down some precepts, and once we got approval to put the money out, there was just nearly $1 million per neighborhood for 3 very heavily impacted neighborhoods, heavily impacted by our 3 departments. We all posted for an executive director. I reached out to Seema to ask her to apply, but, she had to meet with, and, it was a competitive process. It wasn't wired. She had to meet with the 3 secretaries, individually, and everybody loved her, and the rest she can tell you.
Well, I'm going to add to this question, Seema, and then I want to hear how you articulate Safer, Stronger Together coming to be. You write that many government agencies and justice agencies in particular are singularly focused on individuals instead of families or communities, even though young people are, of course, greatly impacted by the health and the stability of both their family and their communities. So why is that an issue, and how did Safer, Stronger Together set out to change this in Maryland? What's different and why?
It's fun. Is this me, Seema,
Oh,
or
it's
this
for
one you?
Seema.
Oh, Seema, sorry.
I'll start out, Vinny, and then you can jump in. I I make this point to people I speak to within government, in community, all the time, that when you are at, a juvenile justice agency, you've got all these case managers, they are really focused on little Johnny, and they care about whether he went to school, whether he is hitting his curfew, how his drug test came out, whether he's attending whatever program we've mandated by the court, et cetera. And they're just laser focused on that young person. Similarly, on the adult side, a parole officer, a probation officer, I mean, even more than on the juvenile justice side, like they really don't care about anybody else in that household. And yet I say that to government workers, community workers. I say, we all know, just like you said, Dana, that a young person or a young adult is going to be heavily impacted. Their success is going to be dependent on the health of the family around them. And a family who's struggling, their success is going to be intricately tied to the health and stability of the community in which they live. And everybody in the room always nods. Everyone agrees. I've never gotten pushback from anybody about that. That is just an intuitive thing that we all understand. And yet our systems, knowing that, when every single person in every system from the top to the bottom knows that to be true, yet our systems don't work with the whole families. And I think that it's not because people who work in these systems are bad people. Frankly, I'm a person who believes really deeply in the great potential of government to make people's lives and communities better. I really do. And And I believe that most people in government are good people who want to wake up in the morning and think that they've helped people and done a good job. But yet, government has a way of getting in the way of itself. We build these systems because of some KPI somewhere, and we measure them based on some outcome we're looking at. And then over time, you build the system and you build the staffing and you build the leadership and you build the performance evaluations. And you've got this huge bureaucracy that's focused on these goals that has forgotten the big picture, has forgotten these core understandings that as human beings, we all intuitively know. And somehow these things they get lost. And so in some ways, Safer, Stronger Together is a prototype within government. It's an effort to say, let's reimagine how we would do things if we had a chance to refashion the whole point from the beginning. Were we to serve families in this case that are touching multiple systems? You've got somebody in your family under juvenile supervision. You've got somebody involved in adult corrections in some way. You've got somebody involved in the child welfare or human services system. If we know we've got a family like that, and we can think about all of the things that family will need, is struggling with, is under stress around, and also the strengths that family potentially has, the resiliency of those communities. Like if we start from that place, what system would we build to serve that family? And when you do that within government, even within the people who are working, existing people in government, and when you add community voices to that conversation, what you get is what government should be doing. And that's what we were trying to do, is to create a prototype and model how we would do things from the beginning. I once read this book called Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And he talks about all of these scientific breakthroughs that are made throughout time. And I think it's so telling for like modern, in many ways, for like modern systems change. But some of the things that he talks about are that people need to see why the system doesn't work, why it's failing to achieve the outcomes it was set out to do, articulated clearly. And then also there needs to be an alternative that exists. It doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to have all the answers, but there needs to be an alternative that exists that they can look to that will solve the problems better. And so what we're trying to do here is create that model and say, you're not getting the outcomes you're looking for here. But in this small little pilot project, we are getting those outcomes. So now what can you change? And in that book, what they talk about is that change happens. It doesn't happen. And then quickly people see an alternative and they can move towards that quickly. And that's been my experience. And that's what we're hoping to achieve here.
So I'll put this question to both of you, and you've each made a little bit of reference to this, but I think it's really helpful for people to hear more about the practical reality of how you get buy-in and support for this type of initiative from state leaders and elected officials. What were some of the challenges? And since you did get this program into 3 locations, how did you overcome them?
You want to go first, Seema?
No, this is all you.
I mean, just to go back to what Seema was saying, those two things, I forget the author you mentioned, Seema, you have to articulate why the current paradigm's not working and then offer people an alternative. I mean, really, that sounds simple, but anybody who's tried to quit smoking or lose weight, right, or exercise more knows that change is hard. But still, those 2 things are the essence of it, right? So explaining from everybody from the governor to the secretaries to staff within our departments to community members, all has to be intentional with those sort of 2 things in mind. I think the easier one is to articulate how the status quo is not working. Right? Not a lot of people came in and said, nah, that's bullshit. We should just keep working on individual problems and we can fix these kids in our facilities, send them back to their communities, and everything will be fine. In fact, quite the opposite. I often heard from my staff and other people, when a kid was in detention, boy, he was doing great. He went to school, he did this, he did that. And as soon as he went home, everything went to hell in a handbasket. Usually that comes with blaming families and some level of racism.
Mm-hmm.
Black folk can't handle their kids, right? And so we need to take them out of there, and really that's somewhat the essence of the origins of the juvenile justice system. It was mostly Irish folks and Europeans back then during the Industrial Revolution can't handle their kids. Let's put them in buildings run by good Protestants, right? And that's evolved to a more racially tainted version of that, right? Let's take them away. They can't handle them. This is saying, well, that doesn't really work so well, right? Because those facilities can be brutal and also to have lousy outcomes. Maybe what we should do is try something different. And then, there had to be some leap of faith that they could believe in us, that we could deliver that thing. When we met with the community, we acknowledged you probably have some skepticism about this because we're here from the government saying we're going to put $1 million on the table and you're really going to get to spend it. And we understand if you're skeptical about that. And there's nothing I can do to prove it to you right now. You'll just have to live with us. And then at the end of it, you can say whether we were honest or not. And I think that's the way it played out. I think there was skepticism initially. I think they appreciated us acknowledging it. But I think they really believed us when we actually wrote checks to the things they agreed to write the checks to. And we provided them with TA, just like I always get provided with TA. So I feel like I'm very smart. They got provided with technical assistance so they could feel like they were very smart. So no, there was nothing. It was all very intentional. It was from literally the governor preparing the presentation to the governor, to the secretaries, to the communities, to elected officials in those communities who also wanted to, sort of be involved. We did not. Our advisory boards are not made up of elected officials. They're made up of people in those communities. But we still spoke with their local elected officials. To our own staff, we had interagency staff training where we unpacked problems that we have and how we divide families by 3. Okay, today, mom, you're going to be a child welfare mom. Your son's going to go in that direction to go to an appointment with my probation officer, and your boyfriend's going over there to talk with his adult parole agent. And we're each going to have 3 different plans for your family. We unpacked all of that stuff. We haven't solved it all, but we did acknowledge it, and we've begun plowing the field in what we hope is the right direction.
Well, I'm very interested for folks to learn about how data drove the SST initiative. What kind of data did you look at? How did it help inform the program? And in particular, how did the data help you choose, as you mentioned, 3 pilot sites?
Okay, I'll jump in on this one. So it actually, before I came on board, Vinny and the 2 other secretaries had a sense, as Vinny has articulated, of the shape of what SST would be. And as mentioned, there was going to be a component that was going to be very community driven. But what was really encouraging to me is that there was a balance between wanting community voice and agency and power to be deeply involved and centered, but also equally a focus on data-driven thinking and evaluation. And I think because we have both, the whole program is stronger. Everything about our initiative is both stronger and better and also more credible. And so when the secretaries articulated this theory that there are probably families across the state of Maryland that, as Vinny just explained, are probably touching all 3 of our systems in some way, and we're probably not working together to serve them. Before the secretaries jumped in to try and do something about it, they wanted to see where the data drove them. And so what the secretaries did, again, before my time, was they asked each agency's data chief to do an analysis. They came together and they said, let's pick a 6-month period of time. It was in the past, it was maybe a year before. They said, over those 6 months, DHS, DJS, DPSCS, all 3 of these agencies, list every single person you touched in the state and where they lived. And so each agency pulled those data points. And then the data teams, the data leads, collated all of that information. Collate may be the wrong word. They crunched all the numbers. That's what they did. They did some magic, and all of a sudden what they found was, in fact, there are families across the state that are touching 2 or more systems, and there are several thousand of those families. But what they also found was that those families and the numbers of those families were highly concentrated in certain zip codes across Maryland, and they weren't equally dispersed across the state. And so they came up with a list of the top 30 zip codes, and at the top was the zip code with the highest concentration of multi-system involved families through these 3 systems, all the way down to the top 30. And then they brought this list to the secretaries, and the secretaries said, and this is when I came online and I was involved in these discussions, but the secretaries said, well, let's also add some other factors in. Can you overlay on that list of locations also places with the highest rates of violent crime, the highest rates of juvenile arrests, the locations that people who are leaving incarceration are saying that they're going to go home to? Also, they wanted to look at factors like health. So they looked at mortality rates, both youth mortality and adult mortality, and also things like the poverty rates. And so these research data folks weighted all of these different factors. They overlaid them on that top 30 zip code list. And what they found was once they overlaid these other crime, health, poverty factors on top, that some of the zip codes moved around a little bit, but for the most part, they were the same places, right? So what that told us was that the same places that have the highest concentrations of families that are, struggling between all 3 of our systems are also the communities that are weighed down by crime, juvenile crime, violent crime, poverty, mortality. And so what the secretaries then did with that data analysis was looked at the individual factors of those top zip codes and chose, 3 sites to be pilot sites that represented Maryland. So one of the sites was going to be in an urban setting, and that was in East Baltimore. One site was going to be in rural Salisbury on the eastern shore of Maryland. One was going to be the site with the highest rates of all of those things on the western side of Maryland. We picked Hagerstown. And so these were 3 very different looking sites, but they all demonstrated high needs in the ways that we had articulated in this data analysis, and they were all 3 at the top of this list.
So can you give us an update on Safer, Stronger Together? How's it doing? What have you learned? And what's the status in Maryland in terms of expanding this work?
Well, there's really good news with the updates so far. We are in our 3rd year, our 3rd phase of Safer, Stronger Together. We started with the 3 pilot sites that I just mentioned. In the 2nd year, we expanded to 2 additional zip codes or sites in Prince George's County. There's great need there. They ranked very high on the list, and there are various reasons that Prince George's County made sense for expansion. And then in this coming year, we're just at the tail end of our budget session, and the governor continues to be a huge supporter of Safer, Stronger Together. And despite a tough budget year and a tough budget climate, has re-upped full funding for Safer, Stronger Together. So we anticipate expanding into 2 additional sites in the coming year. In each of our sites, in our 3 pilot sites, but also in all of our expansion sites, like Vinny mentioned, the first thing we did was we built a community action board. And so in each site, we we talked to local elected officials, we talked to government agency folks who were deeply involved in communities on the ground, and other local leaders, and we got recommendations for people to be on our community action board. They had to live in the zip code that we were serving. And so we put together a community action board in each site, and they have helped lead the programs in their sites. And in each site, that group has articulated what the funding distribution of funds should be. They have done outreach to community grassroots groups, to get people to apply. They've distributed now over $2 million in funding to small grassroots organizations across the state. Also in each site, we hired family navigators. These family navigators, again, are the prototype to how to do government differently, about how we would serve our highest needs families. And those family navigators each serve a set of families. And then also the third thing we do in each site is we bring together the 3 agencies' regional leaders every month in person. And together, that group, we facilitate that conversation 2 hours every month. And we're constantly coming up with ways to collaborate and serve our shared communities better.
It's really incredible. I mean, it's very obvious that this effort centers community voice. You just gave us some real details in how that manifests. And voice is a core pillar of procedural justice. The theory that when people see authorities as fair and trustworthy, they're more likely to comply. So, how do you see voice as a key element of creating safety in particular, safer communities?
Vinny, I'll let you take that one.
Okay. Yeah. And so, I mean, this is, I've had a series of experiences trying to push resources and voice and agency back to communities. When I ran the DC juvenile system, we regionalized our services and put them in the hands of a respected lead entity in each part of the city, so that community had a say in what services, supports, and opportunities young people would get. When I ran New York City's probation department, we created neighborhood opportunity networks in the 7 neighborhoods that had the highest concentration of people on probation in them, set up advisory boards in each one, and again, gave the advisory boards money that we've initially got from foundations, but eventually got from my budget. We gave them to the advisory board, and they re-granted them to arts programs, fix up the neighborhood programs, credible messengers with life experiences, things like that. And so when I was starting in Maryland, I actually pushed off my start date for a week so I could go to Colorado, where after the killing of the head of corrections by a guy on parole, the legislature there put a lot of money into community programs, and they put it in through an intermediary, the Latino Coalition, so that they could support very grassroots programs in the actual communities that people came from. In each of those circumstances, and I believe what Safer, Stronger Together will ultimately show, at least this is the theory, there's an essence to community having voice. And I think, Dana, you touched on the legitimacy aspect of it, and also the cohesion aspect. And I frankly think those are sort of interrelated. Communities with more power and more voice tend to be more cohesive, right? You don't pass the garbage on the street if you feel ownership in your neighborhood. You pick that garbage up, and the more people who pick the garbage up, the less the community looks like a garbage dump. Therefore, I'm not going to break into a car. The theory goes, right? And so in each of the experiences I had before this and others that I've, interacted with at the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in New York, they started this Mayor's Action Plan where they gave lots of resources and lots of power to 15 neighborhoods and very carefully compared the outcomes there to similar neighborhoods throughout New York City. And in each of these examples, there's evidence that it helps drive down bad outcomes and drive up good outcomes. We are going to have, we meaning they, because it used to be me, but now it's them, are going to have an independent evaluation done, a very careful independent evaluation. And my hope is that, when that evaluation comes out, it'll show that there's something to returning voice, returning power, returning resources to communities in a focused and intelligent way.
Well, I'm going to build on what you said, Vinny, and ask another question for you, Seema. Let's talk about measurement, because social cohesion, voice, feelings or perceptions of safety are really difficult to measure, certainly, and not well suited to randomized control trials. So how do you think programs like Safer, Stronger Together can demonstrate their effectiveness in other ways? Right? You mentioned this cleaner street, but what are you looking out for as you do the evaluations, Seema?
So, one of the evaluations we're doing, one that I think is particularly exciting, is really focused on the family navigator work. And this in many ways is piggybacking off of the what Vinny talked about with social cohesion, and Dana, I think your interest in trust and stress and those kind of things, and how do you capture it. So we started early on talking to a researcher named David Weisberg, Dr. David Weisberg. It turns out he was kind of the father of the concept of hotspots policing and the concept of law of concentration. So he was the one who came up with the theory that if you have a quote unquote bad neighborhood, a dangerous neighborhood, crime might be high in this neighborhood. But if you were to break down crime rates, calls for service, violent crime rates, to as small a level as possible and look at just the street segments, intersection to intersection blocks, what you'll find in a quote bad neighborhood is that actually probably about 5% of those street segments produce an outsized amount of crime in that neighborhood. And so for public policy, what that translated into was if you have scarce policing resources and you want to contribute to reducing crime rates in a whole community, you should first identify what are the hot streets, the warm streets and the cold streets, and you should concentrate policing resources onto those hot streets. And if you are to do that, by intervening in a small percentage of the streets, you can have an impact on crime rates across the community. That was the theory. Hotspots policing in the last 20, 30 years has taken off like wildfire. And now pretty much any police officer you talk to around the country will know those words. This is something that a lot of police departments, if not most departments, use. But as you know, a lot of people know, there are a lot of negative externalities to aggressive policing. And that is you put residents at risk of physical harm, you put police officers at risk, you really erode community trust in law enforcement and institutions. So there's great, higher rates of arrests and incarceration, all of these negative things that happen. And another important negative harm or limitation of hotspots policing is that once the police leave, crime bounces right back. And so there's also separately research around collective efficacy and social cohesion that we've been talking around, which always makes sense to me in thinking about one research paper that talks about how you can look at two neighborhoods that are side by side. And one, same kind of demographics, same, poverty rates, income rates, all of the problems, all of those things. But one neighborhood will have low crime and one will have high crime. What's the difference between these two? And what they find is that if you have greater trust between residents, if you have more willingness to work together to accomplish something, if you have greater likelihood that people will intervene and help each other out, you'll have lower crime. And that's the concept of collective efficacy. And so David Weisberg is really fascinated with the idea of possibly trying to take the concept of the law of concentration, and instead of concentrating policing resources in the small segment of either families or individuals or locations that contribute in an outsized way to crime, if you were to instead concentrate social services resources to serve those individuals and those families and those streets, can you similarly reduce crime? Because if that's the case, then not only do you avoid all of the harmful aspects of hotspots policing, but as you build kind of the informal social controls that make up of a neighborhood that has high collective efficacy, those things last beyond when the work is done. So you'll have greater longevity and sustainability. And so what we've done is we've worked with him to develop an evaluation of our Family Navigator work. So in our zip codes, where we have high concentrations of multi-system involved families, we also have street segments that have multiple multi-system involved families that live on them. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is that he and his team have identified, because we only have limited resources, we have a limited number of family navigators who can serve a limited number of families. He's created a randomized control trial where they randomize the families and the street segments with the highest needs because of their multi-system involvement. And then we are randomly selecting the streets that our family navigators are going to be serving, while also having following streets and families that are similarly situated that are getting the existing resources and services of our existing 3 agencies without a family navigator. And over time, we are tracking a number of things. We are tracking the obvious things: recidivism, technical violations of parole and probation, crime rates on the streets, crime rates in the households. But what we're also tracking through various different methods is we're tracking conflict and stress in the home. We're tracking trust in government and trust in institutions. We're tracking access to benefits, so reduced poverty, hunger, and underemployment through acquisition of benefits, along with things like connection of younger siblings who are not just as involved with pro-social activities, visits of family members to the institution where their loved ones are incarcerated, knowing that when people come home and they're closely connected to their families, they're more likely to be successful. So we're taking a lot of different research and using it to develop the model for how we intervene with these high needs families, our Safer, Stronger Together families, and having our family navigators serve those families in all of these ways. And we're going to see how they do compared to the control group. And one thing about the family navigators that I'll mention, they're all connected to the agencies. They have access to all the resources of the agencies. They're community kind of involved themselves, so they know of a lot of community services. But I think one of the most important, if not the most important thing about our family navigators is that they come from the communities that they're serving, and they have personal lived experience in the systems that we are working in. And because of that, they're able to build rapport with the families that they're serving and trust in a way that typically government cannot do. And I believe that's the most critical thing that sets them apart, and I hope will be one of the things that makes them successful for these families.
I just
well,
want to add one
please.
thing to what Seema just said, which is that this flips a lot of things on its head, but one of them that's less apparent is putting more resources into the most challenged and challenging families. We tend to want to be successful because we're human beings, right? And so we want to work with people who, at the end of it, there'll be a better chance they succeed. And so in some respects, can sometimes as agencies put more of our time, our energy into the places where, as a social worker, as a probation officer, let's say, I'm likely to have the most success. This is the opposite of that. This is knowing that I'm going to go into a family that has a lot of complex issues that they're facing, and still throwing down, because we know that if we do well there, we will interrupt a challenging cycle for them, but also for the rest of the neighborhood too.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the people tuning in with us today. I have one here. What urgent social service needs are you seeing among multi-system impacted families, like the families you just mentioned, Vinny, where there's so many complex issues in the 3 sites being selected for this initiative that differ from what might be typically addressed at the state level?
I'll start with something, I get to work with the family navigators and interact with them a lot. And one thing that took me aback, I've been working in this field for a long time. So, I kind of think I assumed I knew what the tenor of the interventions and services would be for these families. But one thing that I didn't anticipate hearing at all was that a lot of the folks that our family navigators are serving, people on probation or parole, juvenile supervision, sometimes what they end up doing is just helping the individual understand what their court order says,
Mm.
right? Like it didn't, I don't think it ever occurred to me, although it's obvious in retrospect, that oftentimes, people hear about what they're supposed to do from their probation or parole officer in the most stressful environment, right? You're in court, you're terrified, you don't understand what's going on. Perhaps you have a lawyer, but they're typically busy and overworked and have to get to their next court hearing or meeting. Or you're hearing it from a probation officer or a parole officer who has your life in their hands. And so the dynamic is a fearful one. And typically those dynamics become constrained by the power dynamic. And so oftentimes people are so anxious because they're not even sure what they need to do, what all these words mean in order for them to be successful. And having a trusted, non-judgmental person who's been through something like this before, who they know they can call on, who they can be vulnerable enough with to say, I actually don't understand all the words on this page, is something that is so foundational that it never occurred to me. And yet I've heard from multiple family navigators that that's something that they routinely do with the people they serve.
Vinny, were you going to add to that? I saw you
Yeah,
now.
I mean, to me, like a lot of time is spent on what kind of therapy people need. Cognitive behavioral therapy, it reduces people's likelihood of recidivism by 10 to 20%, or these kind of drug treatment. And I'm not anti-therapy, but if the fridge is empty and the landlord's pounding on the door, it's kind of not really a conducive environment for therapy. Or if your neighborhood is surrounded by guns, we have a program that's really doing fantastic work with kids who are likely to shoot someone or be shot by someone. And of the arrests that kids get, most of them are gun possession, not use, and not other stuff. They're not out there doing a bad thing with their guns, but their neighborhoods are so saturated by guns that they have them in their pocket. And I don't love that, trust me. But if you put people in this sort of environment of hypervigilance, hypervigilance, and you don't take care of their, basic needs, as Maslow taught us, it's going to be hard to become self-actualized. And so that I think the more you get into very multiple family situations, the more apparent that becomes. And you working with human services on this was really fantastic because they had done a lot of benefit accelerator stuff that overwhelmed families could really use the help on. So, oh, you applied for SNAP? Do you know you're also eligible for this, and this? And here's an app. It just populated all of those applications for you. Just press this button and you'll apply. And I can tell you already you're qualified.
Yeah, but importantly, people are not using the app, but the family navigators walking them through it, sitting with them, that's when they'll use it. Which isn't to say that people don't use it. It's just that the individuals who have the most need, that are struggling with the most complex, multimodal issues, are also often the most isolated. They're the ones that feel enormous amounts of shame. They're the ones who don't want anybody coming into their homes. And so I think the first step is getting inside the home, being trusted enough to be allowed into that world. And then you can start addressing all of the needs. And Vinny is totally right. One of the things our family navigators have, which is incredible, is access to a flexible pot of money that they can use to help with the fridge being empty, or a broken down car, or past rent due that can, puts people at risk of eviction. It's critically important.
That's incredible. I have a question here. I'm going to massage it a bit, and you mentioned so many ways of thinking about measurement and ways that Safer, Stronger Together could have impact. But there's a question here about, and you're adding two more sites, or you have added two more sites. is there a way to measure what's happening inside Maryland government and this interagency solidarity? And are you noticing either a culture change or is there any way to how is it affecting government and the things that government does?
Oh, I love that question. I love that question because of all the work I do, for some reason, I'm most energized by government culture change, and I'm the only person on the planet that thinks that's exciting. It's a great question because I do see culture change. We've bringing people together, having them, see each other, having collaborative conversations. I've been doing cross-agency um, collaboration exercises with line staff at one agency, with line staff at another together, to figure out what are the barriers to why they just don't work together better. Like, what are the, all the deep rooted assumptions about each other, the differences in motivation, etc. And I see a lot of real change, and I think others do too, although there's so much more to do. And yet I don't know if there's a way to capture it or to measure it. I haven't figured it out. I haven't thought about it that hard, but if anybody has ideas, I would love to hear, because I think it's so important, that it's a central part of what Safer Stronger Together is about. But I'm not sure that I know how to, measure it.
All right, well, that's a good place to end. And I want to thank you both, Seema and Vinny, for your conversation today and spending time with us and sharing this rich story of Safer, Stronger Together and change that's happening throughout Maryland and in now 5 communities throughout the state. Our next webinar is Carceral by Another Name, Reforming Civil Commitment. It's on April 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. This session will examine the legal, ethical, and human impact of civil commitment practices, and importantly, explores pathways toward reform that is grounded in solidarity and care. You can register in the events section on our website. And do not forget to download or order your copy of the notebook. Again, www.justicehappenshere.yale.edu. And thank you so much, Seema and Vinny. We look forward to hearing more about the data that's coming out of Safer, Stronger Together.
Thanks much, Dana.
Thanks
This
so
was
much.
really terrific. Yep.
Thanks for having us.